Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing week 10 of my 2021 reads, and I'm going to have a couple of mini updates at the end of this video as well. This week I read 3 books, I DNF'd 3 books, and I paused 2 others. The first book that I finished this week was Root Magic by Royce. This is a new release, middle grade, Southern Gothic historical fantasy. I was really looking forward to this because I had read Spook Lights by Royce, a short story collection, fairly recently and loved the writing style and the magic. So this did not disappoint in terms of how beautiful the writing is. This is a story about a pair of twins who are just turning 11 years old. It is told from the sister's perspective, and they are in the South in the 1960s and dealing with a lot of what's going on around them in terms of racism and politics, but also very much dealing with learning root magic from their uncle. Their family have been for generations practitioners of root magic, and now they're learning how to do it. There's a lot of magical things that are happening around them, some of which are quite dangerous. This has definitely some horror vibes, but it's also, very heartfelt. I really enjoyed the atmosphere and the magic and the history. I think all of these were absolutely fantastic, but I did struggle a little bit with some of the execution. So a lot of this story felt like there were many separate threads, so many separate interactions with magical things around them that almost felt like short stories that were woven together, but they still felt too distinct. They didn't feel like a coherent whole. There also were a couple of issues when it came to a few illogical aspects, some things that didn't make sense that really drew me out of the story. So even though I think that the writing was beautiful and I love the magic and the history, there were still a couple of rough edges on this one. So I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars, but I'm definitely interested in reading more by Royce. Next, I finished Untouchable by Talia Hibbert, which is number 2 in the Ravenswood series. This is set in a small British town and follows a Black woman who ends up getting hired to be a live-in nanny for a guy who is struggling with a couple of things. He's got 2 young kids, but he's also juggling that with having just moved back into town to take care of his mother, who is going through treatment for cancer, and that's demanding a lot of his time. So they end up falling in love. There's definitely a lot of exploration of the difficulties and problems with a power dynamic between an employer and an employee falling in love, but there's also a lot of exploration of things like overcoming grief, things like handling depression, things like really figuring out how to connect when you're each carrying some emotional baggage. Just like all of Talia Hibbert's works, I really loved the banter, I loved the humor in this, I loved the emotion, and I really loved the way that this explored all of those deeper issues in a beautiful romance with a very cinnamon roll, sweet hero guy and a very stubborn female protagonist. So I definitely enjoyed this. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I'm looking forward to reading the last ones in the series soon. Next, I finished Realm of Ash by Tasha Suri, which is the second book in the Books of Amha series, the sequel to The Empire of Sand. This was amazing. This is a book that I have been meaning to get to since I read The Empire of Sand, and I'm so glad that I finally did. I was especially prompted to get a move on reading this because Isabella at Stubbornly Bookish, who I will link below, did a review of this book, which I will link below, and I just was prompted to get on it and actually read it, and I'm so glad that I did. So this is about a woman, Ottawa, who is the daughter of an imperial governor, but her mother was of a tribe, Amrithi, who are these desert people that are very much persecuted, and she has to hide that. Her stepmother has guided her into becoming a proper Amhan Empire woman, noble woman, and she gets married, but at the beginning of the story, we follow her after she has been widowed, after there is a big massacre in the town that she was living in and her husband died. And so now, as as a widow, she has to figure out her place in this society where widows are basically considered nothing. They're almost like ghosts. And she ends up using her Amriti magic in service of the empire to find some purpose in life. So this book was just outstanding, so much so that I'm going to do a series review for both of the books in this series sometime later this week. I think that this was just everything that I'm looking for in a fantasy. I absolutely loved it. The magic is stunning. If you have read The Empire of Sand, the magic in this is shared, but there is a new aspect of the magic, the realm of ash, which is sort of a realm where the ancestors' knowledge and spirits sort of lie, that is explored, and it's completely different, and it's so atmospheric. The magic in this is just really, really engaging and so fascinating, and the world building and the politics. We are in this Amhan Empire, which is very much all about political intrigue, and there is a succession issue that is coming up between the emperor and his sons. There's so much going on in here, and there is an incredibly beautiful slow burn romance in this that I could not get enough of. I absolutely loved it. And all of this also deals with a lot of really fascinating themes too. Issues of colonialism and the costs of it, and the kind of ways that we also desire it. A lot of those problems, a lot of the ways that we conform, a lot of the ways that we suppress who we are. It was absolutely lovely. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. And this makes not just probably one of my favorite books of the year, but probably one of my favorite books of the decade. This was such a great book for me. And if you want to know more, I will have a series review up later this week. Okay, so those are the books that I finished this week. Now moving on to my DNFs, starting with Cracking India by Bapsi Sidhwa, also known as Ice Candy Man. This is a book that I was buddy reading with Keah at BooksandKi, who I will link below, and I was really enjoying the discussions with Keah because there is a lot of interesting stuff going on in this book. It is set in the 1940s, and it is following the partition of India, where India and Pakistan were separated after coming out of the British rule, and it's told from the perspective of a 10-year-old Parsi girl. Parsi is a religious minority, Zoroastrian, as she watches this kind of world break in front of her. And so I knew going in that this would be maybe difficult content because the partition of India was very bloody. Lots of people died, but I was not prepared for the amount of graphicness that would be in this book. So I ended up getting through 63% before I decided I just needed to call it. So this book has a lot of graphic violence in terms of just really graphic murders and dismembering and all sorts of very difficult amounts of violence, but it also is really graphic in other ways that I wasn't expecting. Things like the humor was really gross, just a lot of body humor and a lot of just focus on things that are way too much information, just way too much graphicness. And then also there's a lot of sexuality in this, which I wasn't expecting. The main character is this 10-year-old girl, except she's more like 5 when we start, and she's exposed to so much kind of sex and sexuality around her, and there's some kind of child sexual abuse and other things that are just really, I wasn't prepared for it, and it's done in such a graphic way, but from a child's perspective, it was very uncomfortable, and I just couldn't handle it anymore. So I had to DNF this one. Another buddy read that I DNF'd was Song of a Captive Bird by Jasmin and Darznik. I was buddy reading this with Jen at Remembered Reads, who I will link below, and I was having a very good time discussing this with Jen, but the book itself was just not working for me, so I ended up DNFing it at 33%. And there were a couple of reasons that it didn't work for me. So one of them is just very personal taste in that the story is very dramatic. There's a lot of emotional turmoil and a lot of interpersonal drama, and it's just very dramatic, which isn't so much my style. The other reasons why I struggled with this book were interesting. So this is a historical fiction that is a fictionalized account of a real person's life. So this is about Farrukh Farrokhzad, who was an Iranian poet who lived in the 1950s, 1960s in Iran, and she was very bold and very unconventional, and did a ton of things that were considered scandalous by Iranian society, including the poetry that she wrote. So she's a huge historical figure. Jen actually linked me a really great video that is like an hour-long talk by a professor about Farrukh Farrokhzad's actual life, so a biography. I will link that below. I found that really fascinating. But what I struggled with in this book is that it was very hard for me to tell what aspects of the book were her real life and what was just made up, just fictionalized. Since this is fiction, I understand that a lot of it will be fictionalized, but it was very hard for me to read this and understand what I wanted to take out of it, if that makes sense. The other aspect is that the author, Jasmin Darznik, is not actually somebody who, grew up in Iran or anything like that. She's just of Iranian heritage. And I found that the portrayal of Iran and Iranian people itself felt very Western almost, in the way that it demonized a lot of the social mores and a lot of the kind of way that people acted in their relationships and things like that, such that it felt that the entire country and all of the people in the story, other than the main character, were oppressive and awful. And it just felt almost like a demonization of Iran in the 1950s and 60s. And I'm not sure how much of that was accurate. Maybe it was that oppressive, but it also just felt a little extreme. And again, it could just be the drama in the book that's making it extreme, but I felt rather uncomfortable with that. And I'd be very interested in any Iranian-owned voices reviews talking about, how good that portrayal of Iran in the 1950s is. But I felt a little bit uncomfortable with it, and it felt very extreme. So this book didn't work for me, although I know it has a ton of very, very high ratings on Goodreads, so I am probably not the best person to be getting a review from this for, but for me, it just wasn't the best book for me. Next, I DNF'd The Seep by Chana Porter. This is a 2020 sci-fi novella that I was pretty interested in. I'd heard really great things about this from Bek at MoonyReadsByStarlight, who I will link below. They said that this was just absolutely fantastic, but I found that I was just really struggling with it. I've also been not in the best mood mentally for abstract works, and this one felt very abstract for me. It's almost like a play in that there's a lot of dialogue where characters are discussing deep philosophical issues, and I just found it really hard to connect with what was going on, to follow it, and also some of the philosophical things that were being discussed I didn't 100% agree with. So it was just not working for me, even though the premise of this is very cool. It's basically after an alien invasion of Earth, where the aliens are more focused on peace and connection with nature, and they sort of infiltrate the water supply such that everybody drinks in this drug called the Seep, which makes them very connected with everything around them. And later they also gain a lot of very special abilities and powers that allow them to kind of be whatever they want to be in life. So really cool premise, but it just kind of went over my head, and I did not have the mental energy to keep trying. Although, again, Bek really loved this book, so I think that if you're up to a little bit more mental energy and a little bit more philosophizing and thinking through the consequences of sort of a utopian future, I think that this could be a great book for other people. But for me, I got through 19% and then I just had to stop. Now moving on to the two paused books that I had, both of which were library loans that I wasn't able to finish in time, and I just am not in the mood to recheck them out right now and finish them, even though I was enjoying them and would like to finish them eventually, both of which are nonfiction. And again, I'm just kind of in a weird mental mood where I'm not able to concentrate as much. So the first of these is The Pretty One by Keah Brown. I got through 27% of this before I had to return it. And And it is basically a set of essays by Keah about her life and her experiences as a Black disabled woman, talking about society and pop culture. And I thought that her writing was great. She has a lot of humor in it. It was enjoyable. I liked hearing what she had to say about her experiences and how having cerebral palsy has kind of affected the way she's interacted with people, especially with her twin sister who does not have any disability. And it just was a good set of essays, but I'm just not in the mood to continue right now. So I'll come back to it at another point. The other book that is paused is The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. I got through 17% of this before I had to return it. It is really fascinating in terms of kind of natural history. It is about kind of all of the background that goes into the collection of rare bird feathers following what led up to a man who stole a bunch of them from a natural history museum in order to sell them on the black market for fly fishing. So the premise is hilarious, but the history that goes into this is also just really fascinating, sort of the history of collecting bird feathers. There's a lot in this about kind of that era where a lot of scientists from Britain would just travel the world collecting specimens and taxidermying and all that sort of stuff. It's a little bit gross in terms of all of the animals that are killed in this, but also just really fascinating in terms of what happened with bird feathers. So I do want to continue this. I just am not quite there in the mental mood right now. Okay, so those are all of the books that I read, DNF'd, and paused this week. If you guys have read any of those, you have any thoughts, any comments, just leave me a comment down below. I do have a couple of just very small mini updates that I wanted to talk about. So the first is content warnings. I saw a video recently that Kazen at Always Doing did talking about content warnings. I will link that below. I highly recommend it. I think it's a great video. And that really prompted me to think about adding content warnings myself. So I've been in the back of my mind considering adding content warnings for a while because I think it's useful, but it's also something that is very hard to know what to do because there's no standard really about what content warnings exist or how to do them. But I liked what Kazen had to say and I like the way that she handles it. So I'm going to do something similar, which is basically in the description box for any video where I'm wrapping up or reviewing a book, I will list the content warnings at the very end. So you don't need to read them if you don't want them, but they're there in case you do. These content warnings are things that I came up with as I noticed them in the books, which means that they are not going to be at all comprehensive or perfect because I'm sure that I have missed things, but I'm going to at least be trying. If you guys notice that I'm missing anything significant, do let me know so that I can learn how to kind of improve my content warnings in the future. But from now on, those will be linked in the description box below. So all of the books that I've talked about today, I do have content warnings for. My next update has to do with my monthly priority for April, which is going to change a little bit. So my original plan for my April monthly priority was to read books that were published in 2020 in the SFF genre that were on the short list for the BookTube SFF Awards and the Hugo Awards. But it doesn't look like the BookTube SFF Awards is going to be running this year. I haven't heard anything about it. And I don't think that the shortlist for the Hugos is going to be announced yet. So I'm not going to be doing that for April. And in fact, I think I'm just going to skip doing any priority for April because I could use a little bit of just some free space to read other books. And my last little update is sort of related in that I'm kind of in a funky mood right now. I'm not in a reading slump or anything like that. I'm reading plenty of books, but I'm not up to anything super mentally challenging. So I'm not necessarily reading the things that are on my TBR. I'm just kind of reading what I feel like reading. And I'm not up to sort of the more abstract or challenging works right now. So I have no idea what I'm going to read, if I'm going to follow any TBRs, anything like that, but I am reading. And in terms of videos as well, I am super happy to be working on my weekly wrap-ups and to be doing reviews for books that I love, but I don't know that I have a ton of mental energy to do anything beyond that. So there may be a couple of weeks over the next few months where I just have a weekly wrap-up. I may not have a second video if I don't have a specific review that I want to film, which I think is totally fine. But just wanted to give you a mini update that I have no idea what's going on with my reading. Still doing it, but it's kind of all over the place right now. So okay, that wraps up all of my updates as well as all of my books for this week. I'd love to hear from you guys if you have any updates on what's going on with your life, your reading, any favorite books that you have, anything like that. Just leave me a comment down below.